Welcome to episode 12 of Nudges and Bridges. This sequence now for the next several weeks is going to particularly look at music as a nudge, music as a bridge. And what we'll particularly see that there are going to be several of these that are nudges, not all of them necessarily bridges. It depends on how the nudges are used. Now, just as a reprise of kind of where we were before, because it's been a while since I've introduced some of this material, there is the first category of us and them, followed by rules, followed by golden rule of friendship, followed by a sense of joy or as good as it gets, followed by a sense of perspective, then transcendence, and then a sense that you can move among all of these six previous categories. We're looking first at us and them. And I phrase it that way as us and them because there's different ways to characterize the relationship between us and them. Typically, when you hear of us and them these days, it's in an us versus them because there's one side against the other side, and our side is good and the other side is bad. And that happens a lot. But I want to be clear that there are other components of us and them relationships because we all need an us. We need our family, we need our friends, we need our allies. We need to have a group of people that we can depend on, that we can identify with, that we can socialize with, and have some sort of a relationship with. There is also an us and them that kind of is in between the a negative or a demonization kind of on us and them, where there's a sense of competition, but that does not necessarily rule out that the person that you're competing with is not someone that you also have a degree of respect for. And then there's a kind of an us versus them, where the other side is just bad and you're demonizing them and dehumanizing them. So there's an us and them that has some good, and one that's kind of in between, and some that's recognizing your allies as well. So I thought I would start off with sharing some music tunes that were suggested by my students. Now, these are all undergraduate students, so they're all 19, 20 years old. And the assignment that I gave them was to identify a song that puts them in a frame of mind of thinking us and them. I didn't ask them to identify or to specify what kind of variation of us versus them. And it's important to remember that it was what puts them in that psychological or cognitive category. In other words, it's not necessarily something that they would expect to put everyone in that frame of mind. It just puts them in that state of mind. So it could be reminding them of an event, moment in time that is idiosyncratic to them. Although my sense is that in doing this for several years, that the tunes that they come up with end up others kind of resonating with as well. But so here are three kinds of categories of what my students have suggested. And I do this in order to just whet your appetite of what your songs might look like. The first one, the oppositional one, where you're dehumanizing the other side. And since this is a sequence, or this is a series of trying to how to build bridges and harmony, I'm not going to talk about that because I'm really not wanting to add any fuel to the fire of how to demonize or dehumanize another human being. So I'm just going to leave that one for others to figure out. And as a matter of fact, my students hardly ever picked that one. It was very rare. I mean, in the thousands of students that I've had who have done this exercise, and having a difficult time thinking of more than one or two that ever did something that was really negative or dehumanizing or demonizing or something like that. Where I would see an us versus them in the sense of a competitive component, a notion that I have to compete, and I have to compete with my friends, with my allies, against a something else, whether that is an opponent, and then the opponent could be another individual, a team, without necessarily disrespecting that other opponent or other team. But it could be against a quest, against something that is a hurdle for you, an obstacle for you. I mean, it could be something like addiction, or people that are putting you down, that they say that you can't achieve something. And so you're going to try to prove them wrong. So I've had lots of examples like that. So it's a competitive notion, but not necessarily a dehumanizing kind of a notion. And a couple of songs that stood out a lot with my students this past year are Eminem's Not Afraid And then a song that goes way back to my era, and the 20-year-olds still were picking it, Survivor's Eye of the Tiger from, I think that was Rocky 2, was it? Rocky 2 or Rocky 3? I don't remember which one of them that it was. And so those would be two examples that put you in a state of mind where you are competing, where you are questioning, that you realize that you have a battle that you need to engage in, but not necessarily dehumanizing the other side. And then there's another kind of an us and them, where what you are really celebrating is your alliances or an achievement with your fellow teammates, with a fellow group. And here, hands down, over the years, I've been doing this assignment for about 7 years now. And so I do have thousands and thousands of iterations of this from students. By far, the one that students identify the most, also going back to my era, is Queens, We Are the Champions. You're celebrating a victory, you're celebrating a quest, you're celebrating an achievement, and we are the champions. Not necessarily, being negative toward the other side, but celebrating the accomplishment that you made. So that's a very simple kind of a sketch. But what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to ask you to do at each one of these episodes, if you will, is to identify your playlist, on all these categories of us and them, of rules, of friendship, golden rule, of as good as it gets, of perspective, transcendence, and moving among them. I'm going to ask you to do all of this, but for this one, just in terms of us and them, to identify 3 songs. One that really is a very oppositional song, that we have to win. There's something wrong with the other side. I'm not crazy about that one, but you might as well identify it so you know where you are in that. But then another one that is the competitive one, again, that drives you, that inspires you, doesn't necessarily be negative on the other, against the person or the thing that you're battling against, but something that puts you in a competitive spirit of mind. And then finally, an us versus them, where you are celebrating your alliances, your friends, the people that you worked with in order to achieve something. So why don't we start with that very simple exercise? What's your playlist? Us and them, us versus them.